Hey, what is up, and welcome to Myth Monday. This is where all the ladies at. It is a podcast designed to put a spotlight on women in myth, legend, and history, because I just don't think they get enough credit, or they seem to get written out of history real easily. You know, if somebody needs to get dropped out of that, it's the woman. So that's kind of why I did it. And if you're asking who I am, my name is Kim. I'm a history nerd. I am a novelist. I am just a crazy person when it comes to learning things and sharing things, and that's what I love to do. So this month, we're focusing on two different things. So Illyrian goddesses on Mondays, and then on Thursdays, we're covering warrior queens. This week, it just happens that... we're covering Illyrians all week, because the Illyrian goddess we're covering today is Nebra, the goddess of storms and mist. And on Thursday, we're covering Tuta, which was an Illyrian pirate queen, which sounds freaking awesome. If I was going to be a queen, I'd want to be a pirate queen, I think. Yeah, or a warrior queen. One of those two. Definitely just want to be a normal queen. Ugh, yuck. Maybe even I would like to be called a king, and there's actually one of those that we're going to talk about this month. As I said, I'm covering warrior queens, so this week is Tuta. I also have Tamar and Kabuba. One of them became a king, and one of them became a goddess. So pretty badass ladies. And Tuta, who is the one we're covering this week, we'll learn more about her, but she really became a thorn in some people's sides, which is amazing. I love it. But today, like I said, we're covering Nebra, the Illyrian goddess of storms and mist. That's the topic for today. So before we jump into that, let's talk about a little housekeeping and shameless plugging. If you would like to reach out to me, there's plenty of ways to do that through my social media, or if you're watching on YouTube, you can just comment here. I also have an email you can send if you like to rock it old school. If you want to support the podcast, the best way to do that is to like, share, follow, subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. Get my name out there in the algorithm so that the algorithm starts pushing me to more people, and then that means that we can build a bigger community, because I do have some really cool ideas in mind if we can get a good community going. Also, if you do have a little cash and you want to kick it my way, I do have a Patreon and a Buy Me a Coffee, which hasn't had much traction going to it, but in April or May, I'm going to try April. There's going to be more movement on that. There'll be some new stuff coming out, maybe some artwork, maybe some ebooks, special conversations, options to, choose the topic for the month. Or if I already have a topic, maybe choosing the people I cover. Things like that are all on the plate potentially for those. And they should be, like I said, April or May should get more active. I also have a Medium publication for this podcast, which has been inconsistent, but there's some good stuff there. So if you want more about this goddess or any others that I've covered and so much more, make sure you check it out. It will start being more consistent going forward as well. And that goes for my TikTok and my Instagram for this podcast. It's been kind of bleh, and so it's going to be better going forward. I also have a other podcast called Our Mystic Road Trip. So if you're into magical, spiritual kind of stuff, wellness, holistic healing, woo-woo stuff, that's where you should go to. So check it out if you're interested in that. And that is it for the shameless plugging and housekeeping. There'll be more at the end. All right, so let's jump into Nebra, the Illyrian goddess of storms and mist. All right, so here's the thing. Before we jump into her, I really want to talk about the Illyrians, because in order to understand the goddesses and the mythology, you kind of need to understand the people, right? Now, if you watched Anzotica from last week, I already kind of went over the Illyrians, so a lot of this information you may find very similar. But for me, I try to act like each podcast is the first podcast someone is going to listen to. And so if I'm covering the same topic, It's so that they get a good basis, right? So let's talk about the Illyrians. So here's the thing, right? Illyria is the region where now Albania, Croatia, Kosovo, Bosnia, Herzegovina, those are all situated. So the Balkans, right? And so if you look at that region, you'll notice that it's smack dab between Italy, which would be where the Roman Empire started, and then Greece, which was where the Greek Empire started, right? So as these two big empires were trying to build themselves and affect the world in general, they had to contend with the people that lived in Illyria. There was no way around it. In order to get to where they needed to go, they had to go through Illyria most of the time. I mean, they could go through the waters, but even the waters, and you'll see that on Thursday, even the waters were a little bit testy in that area, right? So the Illyrians were really well known for being very fierce warriors, and they were very tough. And the reason they were so tough was because the environment they grew up in. If you've been to that part of the world, and I have, and it's like my favorite place in the world, it's one of my favorite, well, I won't say it's my favorite, but it's definitely in the top 5 for sure. There's like rugged mountains, there's dense forests, right? And so this creates, the environment creates you, right? It was wild, it was unpredictable. And so the Illyrians had to be tough. And when you look at the fact they had goddesses like Nebra, who were goddess of storms, if you had to survive there, you needed to be strong and adaptable, right? And that's exactly what they were. This warrior culture, right, was very central to their identity. And they were known for being really, really good at resisting invaders, right? They were not ones to be very easily conquered. And despite the fact the Roman and Greeks tried to push into their territory every time, thinking that something was going to change. And, in the end, it eventually did. Most of what we know about the Illyrians comes from the Greeks and the Romans, right? Because the Illyrians didn't write shit down. It's just not what they did. They were too busy kicking ass and taking names. They didn't even have a bubble gum to chew. What the? And if you get that reference, I love you even more. All right. And so the details are very sketchy, right? And you have to understand that you're getting it from basically their enemy, right? So the picture of their society was skewed, but what you can get from it is that they were very deeply, as I said, embedded in the warrior ethos, right? Their culture emphasized personal bravery as well as strength of community. They were very much about protecting their tribes, because that's what they were, guys. Like the Illyrian, even if you say the Illyrian Empire, within that area, it wasn't really an empire. It was more like a bunch of tribes that worked together sometimes, right? And so, especially when it came to trying to fight to preserve their way of life, right? They were very proud, they were very warrior-like, and that's one of the things that set the Illyrians apart from the Mediterranean neighbors. Not that I don't think the Greeks were strong warriors, obviously they did, obviously the Romans were strength, but really the Illyrians, that's what they were known for, right? Kind of like the what are they, the Scythians? I don't know, something like that. I'd have to look at the spelling. There were some famous Illyrians. One of them we're going to talk about Thursday, so I don't want to talk too much about her, but she was Tuta, and she was like the queen of the Aridaei. Oh, they have, so here's the thing, guys. Sometimes when I'm pronouncing it, it's because I speak English, right? And so we don't put 4 vowels together. It doesn't sound right. It's I-A-E-I. So Aridaei, maybe? And she ruled in like the 3rd century BC. But we're not going to talk too much about her because, as I said, Thursday's episode is all about her. And I'm so excited, right? But you had also things like Bato of the Dorsi, and he led a rebellion against Rome, and he was very successful in resisting against Rome, and really became like this sign of Illyrian. And I'm talking about a guy right now, but that's fine. I'm just giving you an idea of who they were, right? You have King Gentius, and he was the last king before Rome finally was able to bust that door down. So There's some very cool people. I would say if you have never heard of the Illyrians, check them out. I had never heard of the Illyrians, as I said last week, until I went to Albania. And then I got a big dose of Illyrian going to the museums and everything. And I just have to say there's some amazing stuff there. So, and I really fell in love with trying to learn about that region of the world. And honestly, like Eastern Europe and the Slavic, so the Balkans, the Slavic nations, all that. This is stuff that I kind of knew a little bit about, but wanted to know more. So, with that being said, let's talk about what it was like for women. Now, they weren't side characters in Illyrian, right? They played a big part in shaping society. They did, both at home and in battle, right? Illyrians were known for their warrior men and women, and they were both deeply involved in their communities, right? And women held many places of respect and influence. They were included in rituals and ceremonies and passing down of traditions. And they didn't just stay at home and knit and bake bread. That wasn't what they did. They did those things, I'm sure, but they were like warriors in their own right, right? And as I said, a good example of that is Queen Tuta, who led her people, but also was out there like fighting with the Bim, right? In the mythology, it's no different. Nebra, the goddess we're going to talk about today, really shows what the Illyrians felt about women, right? She has a lot of strength. She has a lot of power. She did not wait for the gods to come and save her. Oh, right? No, that wasn't who she was, right? She was a goddess of storms. And this kind of, sometimes I think when they have goddesses of storm, I really think it shows like that they really understood the power that women had, and so in both real life and in myth, women were very capable of embodying strength and force, right? They weren't just seen as nurturers, although they were. They were a big part of the natural order, and that shows both in how they were treated as women, and then in both myth and in history, as I said. So, now we have a little idea about the Illyrians. Let's talk about Nebra, okay? Nebra may not be the first goddess that comes to mind when you think about ancient mythology. Obviously, Illyrian mythology is not very well known. That's what I was trying to say. I told you my words weren't working. All right, she was a storm goddess, but her power wasn't just about thunder and lightning, right? Nebra ruled over mist as well, and fog. And so this was an interesting thing, because a lot of times you have gods or gods of storms, but this is very specific. She was the goddess of mist as well, right? And so if you think about where they were in mountains and dense forests, so mist could very well be like both good and bad, right? Her storms weren't about destruction, really. It was more, they were like showing the unpredictability of raw force, right? Why is that important? As I said, they lived in land of rugged mountains, right? And unpredictable weather, and their daily lives were affected by this, right? If there's constant rain, sudden storms, fog, right? It could really ruin their day or be good for them too, right? If they're being attacked and mist rolled in, Nebra saved them, right? All of these things that happened every day, like rain and fog and mist and all that kind of stuff, were kind of normal for Illyrians. It was part of the reality, right? And they respected it. They saw the weather as something like alive, right? And that's where Nebra was, right? So in a way, Nebra was a perfect representation of the environment they lived in, right? Wild, powerful, unpredictable, kind of who she was, right? I think the tendency for us as we look at mythology and we see storms and goddesses of that, we have a tendency of like just, oh, that's destruction, but it was more than that, right? Wasn't limited to the chaos. She also symbolized the necessary change that storms bring, right? After the storm, with the saying, there's always a rainbow after the storm, and that's a good thing, right? Snow can clear the air, rain can nourish the earth, even, all that kind of stuff. So Nebra's role was really kind of, once again, a dualistic role, as we've seen so many times as we talk about these goddesses and heroes and everything, where she can both be someone who brings life as well as destroys it, right? And so it's that constant balance. And I think, once again, and I've said this a number of times, I think that's very present in the ancient religions and spirituality, is that very much understanding of the duality, right? Nebra is obviously, if we talk about her symbolism and her worship, like, it's basically the natural world, right? So she controlled thunder and lightning and rain and mist, right? But those were just dramatic entrances, right? They held a lot deeper meanings for Illyrians, of course. So her control of the mist fog is particularly kind of interesting, as I said, because while rain and thunder often symbolize like the more direct, obvious forces of nature, mist and fog carry a more subtle and mysterious energy. And I think that's something, right? Fog could obscure, hide, and create confusion. It's not hard to imagine how the Illyrians kind of would have associated the presence of fog with the goddess, right? When it comes to worship, Nebra wasn't someone you'd find in a grand marble temple. That's just not who. A lot of the old goddesses and gods of some of these religions, there was no way they were having a big fancy temple, like, maybe the Greek gods, maybe the Roman gods, but that was more the impetus of us humans, right? So definitely more earthy. We're very closely, the symbols and worship was very closely tied to nature. And so, there wouldn't have been a big altar. It would have been very like small groves, rivers, maybe mountain peaks, places where you could see that stuff happening. I would imagine, and this is kind of from what I've gathered, like doing research through the archaeological stuff, that a lot of the offerings would very much be symbols of strength and resilience. Food, of course, weapons, maybe, right? The Illyrians were had very strong tie to being warriors, and that would be a good thing. And items like this would kind of reminded the Illyrians of like the balance between life and death, kind of, and her worship, I think, wasn't limited really to grand ceremonies. I think you'll find that it was more personal and intimate. Nebra was probably felt it in every day. She was one of those everyday goddesses. And, even though they knew that she was inescapable, right? Storms were going to happen. They kept her close, right? They didn't put her on a pedestal. They didn't, she was just there. She was there every day, and they helped shape her life, right? So, archaeological, I mentioned the archaeologists, and I'll repeat again, I really feel archaeologists are like unsung heroes. Like, there's so many things we wouldn't know or understand if it wasn't for them. So when it comes to Illyrians, finding evidence about their gods, especially Nebra, is like trying to put a puzzle together, and there's like a lot of missing pieces, right? So she doesn't really show up in every ancient text, and that doesn't mean she wasn't an important figure. It just means, remember, the Illyrians didn't write anything down, so we're only getting it through the eyes of the people that went through there or dealt with them, so the Romans and the Greeks primarily. And, all their religious practices were oral, right? So we don't have an organized library of Nebra's mythos, but there are some things that have happened. Archaeologists have uncovered a range of artifacts from the Illyrians, and this includes, of course, pottery and figurines and inscriptions and such. Many artifacts depict a lot of different gods and goddesses, and really shows that they had like a rich, complex religious life. And of course, there's no way to pinpoint Nebra in these objects really directly, but the imagery we do find, the gods were tied to nature and weather, and was part of a larger belief system, right? So the Illyrians were surrounded by the raw power. One interesting thing that happens is there's a connection to Nebra's storm domain, and that is the Nebra sky disk. Now, This dates back to the Bronze Age, right? This artifact. And it's not directly linked to Illyrian Nebra, but it offers a glimpse into kind of a cosmic worldview the Illyrians might have had, right? The Nebra sky disc is this like intricate, and I'll maybe put it over here, intricate bronze disc that really represents celestial bodies, right? The sun, the moon, and is assumed to symbolize the importance of heavens and the natural forces in the Illyrian culture. The disc itself isn't necessarily like a depiction of the storm god, but it's possible that it reflects the Illyrians' connection to the celestial world, which and that means the weather related, because the sky, right? Now, it's a pretty interesting thing. Now let's really zoom out and let's kind of look at what was going on in the Illyrian world at the height of Nebra's worship, right? So this will help us maybe get some idea of what role she played in everything, right? So the Illyrian kingdom was really prominent around the 3rd and 4th centuries BCE, and this was the time of the big expansion for the Illyrians, right? They controlled portions of the Balkans, as I said, modern day Albania, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and they were warriors, right? In a broader context, like everything was about nature, right? So you can see why it's very hard. It's very, very hard, We can also look at, there has been some archaeological finds of Illyrian burial sites and sanctuaries, and this can help us understand a little bit more, just in general about what they would offer to a goddess, like weapons, foods, figurines, as such, right? And given that she was connected to storms and mist, they could have places where the elements were most present, right? Obviously, I talked about this. Even without, I think, the interesting thing is, even without a vast library of written text, right? The evidence that has been found by suggests that Nebra, or some goddess tied to the forces of nature, was very central to Illyrian spirituality, right? Her worship was probably not as organized as that of the more well-known gods, like the Greeks, the Romans, but that doesn't mean they're any less meaningful, and I do think it's pretty cool. So, now that we've gotten through all that, it's story time, which is one of my favorite times. I want to always put a little preface to saying that because there's not a lot of written mythos, this is very much me looking at what I researched and found out and creating a story kind of based off of that. So, is this a real myth? There may be a little to it, but it's more me kind of fictionalizing the myth, right? So, as usual, please grab your beverage of choice, whether that be a cocktail or a cocoa, and a blanket, and curl up, and let me tell you a story about Nebra. So, in the time long ago, when the Illyrian coast was a place of both beauty and danger, there lived a young warrior named Thasos. Strong and proud, Thasos was known throughout the land for his courage. He sailed across the seas, fighting in battles, seeking glory, and conquering every challenge that came his way. The very winds themselves seemed to carry him forward, guiding him to ever greater victories. But there was one force that even the bravest warriors feared, the power of the storm. One fateful evening, as the skies darkened and clouds gathered like an army, Thasos set sail from the coast, his heart full of ambition and his eyes on the horizon. He thought nothing could stand in his way, not even the wild, untamed elements. The sea roared with fury, and soon the winds began to howl like wolves in the night. The ship rocked violently against the waves, creaking and groaning under the pressure of the storm. Thunder cracked and lightning slashed the sky like a sword. Thasos gripped the helm of his ship, trying to steer through the chaos, but the storm was relentless. His ship, sturdy and proud, was no match for the rage of the sea. The waves rose higher and higher, and in a moment of terror, Thasos watched as his vessel was torn apart by the violent waters. He was thrown into the sea, struggling to keep afloat as the storm battered him. As the darkness closed around him, Thasos heard a voice, a soft whisper, barely audible over the crash of the waves and the roar of the wind. "Turn back, Thasos. The storm was meant for you." Thasos spun around, trying to see the source of the voice, but the mist around him thickened like a shroud. He could barely see his own hands, let alone the horizon. His heart raced with fear, and just when he thought he might drown, The clouds parted, revealing a figure in the distance. There, standing on the jagged cliffs above the shore, was a woman. Her hair flowed like the storm itself, wild and untamed, and her eyes flashed with the intensity of lightning strike. She was tall and commanding, her presence both terrifying and majestic. The storm seemed to bend around her as if she were the very embodiment of the tempest. "I am Nebra," she declared, her voice both calm and fierce. "I am the storm goddess. You are the fool who dared to challenge the elements. Do you not fear the wrath of the skies?" Thassos, drenched and exhausted, felt the weight of her words. His hands trembled, but he refused to show weakness. "I fear nothing," he declared boldly, though his voice quivered slightly. "But I beg you, let me live. I still have battles to fight, glory to earn. I am not ready to die." Thus, Nebra's gaze was unyielding, her expression both fierce and serene, as if she understood something that Thassos did not. She gazed at him for a long moment before speaking. "You are brave, but not wise," she said softly. "In your quest for glory, you have forgotten the true power of the gods. Know this, warrior. Survival is not always the reward of the brave. It is the gift of wisdom." As her words echoed through the air, something miraculous happened. The storm began to calm, the wind slowed, the rain lessened, and the fog that had enveloped him like a prison began to lift. The clouds parted, and the sun broke through, casting a golden light over the land. The sea, once furious and violent, now lay still and peaceful. Thassos found himself standing on dry land, the beach before him calm and untouched, as if the storm had never happened. Nebra was gone. The storm was gone, and Thassos was left alone on the shore, his heart heavy with the realization that he had been in the presence of something much greater than his own ambition. Was it a dream? Was Nebra real? Or was she a vision sent by the gods? Thassos could never say for certain, but what he knew for sure was that he had been changed by the encounter. He had learned a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Nature's power is not something to be battled or conquered. It is something to be respected and understood. And in that moment, Thassos realized that true wisdom lay not in defying the storm, but in knowing when to stand back and let the forces of the world take their course. With newfound humility, Thassos left the shore. No longer the same young warrior who had sought only glory, he had learned to respect the gods and untamable power of the world. And with that wisdom, he became a legend in his own right, not for his victories, but for his understanding the forces that shape the world. And so, the myth of Nebra, the storm goddess, lived on, a reminder to all that nature's wrath is not to be feared, but honored. I like it. Hey! Not too shabby, right? I think it gets the aura of who she was, the aura of her message. You know, Nebra is one of those fascinating and yet elusive figures, right, in ancient mythology. Obviously, because the mythos is not well known, right? But she's all about the raw, unpredictable nature of the world. But we don't have to be afraid of it in some ways, right? We should fear it, but respect it, I think, is kind of what I would say. You know, we don't have a lot of concrete evidence about her worship or anything about her, really. Few things, pieces here and there. So I think getting out there and finding out more about her would be amazing. And I hope I inspired you to do that. And that's it for this week, guys. That's Nebra. She is an amazingly cool goddess that I wish we knew more about. And maybe someday we will. Who knows, right? As always, guys, if you want to reach out to me, like I said at the beginning, there's ways to do that in the description box. You can contact me through social media. You can use the email there. You could also, if you would like, just message me here if you're watching on YouTube. If you want to support the podcast, like, comment, share, follow, that would be amazing. I would love you guys all for doing that. If you do have a little cash and you want to kick it my way, check out my Patreon and my Buy Me a Coffee. If you want more information on this goddess and others and so much more, make sure you check out my Medium publication. And if you're into magical, spiritual, wellness, all that kind of stuff, anything that's woo-woo, as they say, maybe check out my other podcast called Our Mystic Road Trip. And as always, guys, that is it for this week. I hope you stay curious, stay blessed, and stay safe. See ya.